He was called the most evil man in Hitler's army, and yet his name is barely remembered. Oskar Dirlewanger wasn't born into greatness, he was born into darkness. From his earliest days in 1895 in the quiet town of Würzburg, Germany, he showed a disregard for law and morality that would later define his life. As a young man, he committed theft, assault, and other crimes, landing repeatedly in prison. Yet even jail couldn't tame him. If anything, it sharpened his ruthlessness. When World War I erupted, Dirlewanger enlisted, and the horrors of the battlefield only fueled his cruel nature. He learned to kill efficiently, to dominate, and to instill fear, skills that would later make him a weapon even the Nazi leadership found dangerous. After the war, he returned to civilian life, but society could not contain him. He drifted through petty crimes, arrests, and a life on the fringes of legality, cultivating a persona that thrived on violence and chaos. By the 1930s, Dirlewanger's criminal past caught the attention of the rising Nazi Party. His brutality, his fearlessness, and his complete lack of morality made him perfect for Hitler's vision of terror. He was recruited into the SS, a place where lawlessness was not punished but rewarded, provided it served the Führer's goals. It was here that Dirlewanger would ascend from criminal to commander. The SS assigned him a unique task: suppress resistance in occupied territories. But ordinary soldiers could not carry out the level of brutality Hitler demanded. That is when Dirlewanger formed his unit, officially known as the SS Sonderkommando Dirlewanger. Its members were drawn from criminals, poachers, deserters, and men rejected by society. In this brigade, murder, rape, and arson were not crimes, they were qualifications. Reports from the Eastern Front painted a horrifying picture: villages burned, civilians slaughtered, entire towns erased in the blink of an eye. Dirlewanger led with a combination of cunning strategy and unthinkable cruelty, and his men followed not out of loyalty but fear. Even high-ranking Nazi officers who had seen the worst of war were shocked by his methods. Yet Dirlewanger's unit became indispensable to Hitler. The more brutal and uncontrollable he was, the more the regime relied on him to crush uprisings, terrorize populations, and enforce Nazi control. His name remained whispered in fear, even within the SS, because one never knew when he would unleash his fury or what unimaginable crime he would commit next. And just as he carved a trail of terror across Europe, a far deadlier chapter of his life was about to begin, a chapter that would mark him as one of the darkest figures in World War II. As Dirlewanger's brigade roamed the Eastern Front, his reputation for cruelty grew to almost mythical proportions. Reports from occupied Poland and Belarus described horrors that seemed almost unbelievable. Villages were not merely attacked, they were erased. Men, women, and children were slaughtered indiscriminately, their homes set ablaze, their fields burned. Survivors would speak in whispers of a unit that operated without law, without mercy, without conscience. But Dirlewanger's power was not just in numbers, it was in the fear he instilled. His men were trained to be utterly ruthless, but even they were sometimes shocked by his methods. Eyewitnesses recall that he would personally oversee massacres, laughing as terror spread among civilians. Some accounts even suggest he rewarded the most brutal soldiers, creating a culture of extreme violence that fed itself. By the 1940s, Dirlewanger's brigade was tasked with a mission that would cement his infamy: suppressing the Warsaw Uprising. Resistance fighters, ordinary citizens, and even children became targets of the unit's unrelenting brutality. Tens of thousands perished in mere days, and the streets of Warsaw became a living nightmare. Hitler relied on Dirlewanger not despite his sadism, but because of it. In a twisted calculus, the more feared he was, the more effective he became in the eyes of the Nazi regime. Even high-ranking officers within the SS whispered about his unpredictability. Some suggested his cruelty bordered on madness, yet in a war fueled by violence, Dirlewanger was indispensable. His name, barely mentioned in history books, was known everywhere he operated, a shadow of terror that left destruction in its wake. And as the war approached its final stages, Dirlewanger would carry this trail of terror into territories that believed themselves safe but were about to learn the full measure of his cruelty. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 would become the dark pinnacle of Dirlewanger's cruelty. When Polish resistance fighters dared to reclaim their city from German occupation, Hitler entrusted Dirlewanger with the mission to crush them, no matter the cost. What followed was a level of violence so extreme that even seasoned Nazi officers recoiled. Streets were transformed into rivers of fire, homes reduced to rubble, and civilians were murdered en masse. Children and the elderly were not spared. Terror was total and indiscriminate. Dirlewanger himself often led the attacks. Eyewitnesses describe him laughing as buildings burned and screams filled the air. Soldiers under his command were compelled to outdo each other in brutality, creating a feedback loop of inhuman violence. Reports from survivors detail unspeakable acts, executions carried out in public, entire families massacred for resisting even the smallest demands, and towns emptied of life in a matter of hours. Despite the imaginable horror, Dirlewanger was seen as invaluable to the Nazis. His reputation for cruelty made him a weapon against any form of resistance. Hitler's regime rewarded the very behavior that most would call madness, and Dirlewanger wielded this license with terrifying precision. High-ranking officers whispered his name with fear. Ordinary soldiers obeyed him out of terror. By the end of the uprising, tens of thousands had died. Warsaw lay in ruins, and Dirlewanger's brigade had stamped its mark of absolute terror. Yet even with this trail of destruction, the world would remain largely unaware of the full scale of his atrocities. History books would barely whisper his name, but for those who survived, the memory of his brutality was unforgettable. And as the Allies advanced and Germany's collapse became inevitable, Dirlewanger's reign of terror would follow him into territories that thought themselves safe, but were about to learn the full measure of his cruelty. As the tide of war turned against Germany, Dirlewanger's brigade retreated across Eastern Europe, leaving destruction in its wake. Hungary, Slovakia, and Austria became theaters of terror as the Allies advanced. Despite Germany's crumbling front lines, Dirlewanger continued his reign of cruelty. Retreat for him was not defeat, it was another opportunity to unleash unthinkable violence. Civilians who thought they were safe were caught in his path, and his men, hardened by years of sadism, followed his orders without hesitation. Even the SS, the organization that had nurtured and elevated him, began to view Dirlewanger with unease. His alcoholism, unpredictability, and extreme violence made him a liability, yet Hitler and his inner circle could not let him go. Dirlewanger had become a weapon too dangerous to control, but too effective to discard. In late 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed and Allied forces tightened their grip, Dirlewanger was finally captured by French soldiers. His end was chaotic and mysterious as his life. Reports suggest he was beaten to death in custody, though some accounts claim he briefly attempted to escape before meeting his demise. The exact details remain unclear, shrouded in the fog of war. Dirlewanger's death did not erase the horrors he had inflicted. Tens of thousands of lives had been destroyed, entire towns annihilated, and countless families left with scars that would last generations. Yet in the annals of history, his name is often omitted as a chilling reminder of the darkness that one man could wield when morality was abandoned. Even today, historians debate how could a criminal, a man utterly consumed by cruelty, rise to become one of the most feared figures in World War II. The answer lies not only in his brutality, but in the war itself, a world where terror could be weaponized and humanity's darkest impulses exploited.
With Dirlewanger dead, one might think history had closed the chapter on one of World War II's most monstrous figures. Yet, remarkably, his name remains largely absent from mainstream accounts. While tens of thousands of lives were destroyed by his unit and entire cities reduced to rubble, most history books barely whisper his name. Why? Perhaps it is because the atrocities he committed were so extreme that they seemed almost unreal, difficult for even historians to comprehend or confront. Dirlewanger's legacy is not measured in medals or victories, it is measured in fear. He became the embodiment of unchecked cruelty, a man whose sadism was rewarded rather than punished in a time of war. His brigade, composed of criminals and outcasts, became the perfect tool for a regime that valued terror above morality.
Subscribe for more history.